In December of 1945, a young Egyptian farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman rode his camel to the base of the Jabal al-Tarif, a massive cliff formation that rises from the Nile's edge near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt. He was searching for sabak, a soft, nitrogen-rich soil formed from decayed plant matter that local farmers used as fertilizer for their crops. The cliff face was honeycombed with caves, and al-Saman knew that within these ancient hollows, the soil was often particularly rich. As he struck the earth with his mattock, the tool hit something solid. At first, he assumed it was a boulder and prepared to dig around it, but the sound was wrong. Not the dull thud of stone against stone, but something more brittle, more hollow. He cleared away more soil, and there, embedded in the red clay, was a large earthenware jar, sealed with a bowl-shaped lid and standing nearly 2 feet tall. The jar was old, very old, its surface worn smooth by centuries of compression beneath the earth. Al-Saman hesitated. Local folklore warned that such jars could contain jinn, malevolent spirits that would curse anyone foolish enough to release them. But the jar might also contain gold, and Al-Saman's family was poor. The promise of treasure outweighed the threat of curses. He raised his mattock and brought it down hard on the vessel's rim. The jar shattered. A cloud of golden dust rose into the desert air, particles catching the slanting winter light. For a moment, Al-Saman must have felt the cold touch of superstitious dread. But there were no jinn, no curses. Instead, tumbling from the broken jar were 13 leather-bound books, their covers worn but intact, their pages dense with text in a script Al-Saman could not read. They were written in Coptic, the latest form of the ancient Egyptian language, expressed in Greek letters. What Muhammad Ali al-Saman had discovered, quite by accident, was one of the most significant archaeological finds of the 20th century. These were the Nag Hammadi codices, a library of early Christian and Gnostic texts that had been deliberately hidden sometime around 390 CE, during a period when the increasingly powerful Christian Church was systematically destroying texts it deemed heretical. For 1500 years, these books had waited in darkness. Now they would speak again. But Al-Saman did not immediately grasp the importance of his find. He brought the codices home and dumped them on the ground near his house. His mother, looking for kindling to start her oven fire, burned several pages before anyone realized what they were. Some of the codices were given away to neighbors, others were shown to local merchants and religious teachers, who recognized that the books were old and perhaps valuable, though none could fully translate them. Eventually, through a chain of dealers and collectors, the codices began to make their way to Cairo. One of them ended up in the hands of a Belgian antiques dealer named Albert Ede, who in turn showed it to Jean Dorès, a young French scholar studying Coptic manuscripts at the French Archaeological Institute in Cairo. When Dorès examined the text, he realized immediately that he was looking at something extraordinary. The codex contained previously unknown writings attributed to early Christian figures, texts that had been mentioned in the writings of the Church Fathers, but were thought to have been lost forever. Word of the discovery spread through the small, specialized world of biblical scholarship. By 746, the Egyptian government had become aware of the find and moved to secure the remaining codices, which were eventually deposited in the Coptic Museum in Cairo. But the process of translation and publication would take decades, hampered by political instability in Egypt, scholarly disputes over access to the texts, and the sheer difficulty of working with fragile manuscripts written in a language that few modern scholars could read fluently. The man who would eventually oversee the publication of the complete Nag Hammadi library was James M. Robinson, an American biblical scholar who began working on the project in the late 1960s. Robinson spent years tracking down the scattered codices, negotiating with Egyptian authorities, coordinating teams of translators, and piecing together the circumstances of the original discovery. His detective work revealed that the codices had likely been produced by a nearby monastery, perhaps Pachomius's monastery at Pabau, and had been buried by monks who were trying to preserve texts that the church had ordered destroyed. The complete Nag Hammadi library when finally published in English in 1977, comprised 52 texts. Some were Christian Gospels that had never been part of the biblical canon. Others were philosophical treatises, mystical poems, and cosmological myths. Together, they offered a window into a form of early Christianity that had been almost entirely erased from historical memory, a form that modern scholars would come to call Gnosticism. The word Gnosticism derives from the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge, but this was not ordinary knowledge, not the kind of information one might learn from books or teachers. Rather, it was a special, mystical knowledge, a direct experiential understanding of the divine nature of reality and of one's own true self. The Gnostics believed that this knowledge was salvific, that it could free the soul from its imprisonment in the material world and return it to its proper home in the realm of light. Central to Gnostic teaching was a radical reinterpretation of the creation story found in the book of Genesis, where mainstream Christianity saw the creation of the world as a good and intentional act by a benevolent God. The Gnostics saw something darker and more troubling. To them, the material world was not the work of the true God at all, but rather the flawed creation of a lesser ignorant deity, a false God who had trapped divine sparks of light, fragments of the true God within physical bodies. The material world in this view was not a paradise from which humanity had fallen, but a prison from which humanity needed to escape. This was a profoundly subversive idea. It challenged not only the authority of the Hebrew Scriptures, which the Church had adopted as the Old Testament, but also the very structure of religious authority itself. If salvation came through direct personal gnosis, rather than through the Church's sacraments and teachings, then what need was there for priests, bishops, and ecclesiastical hierarchy? If the creator God of Genesis was not the true God, but a deluded tyrant, then what authority did his laws and commandments hold? The Church Fathers understood the threat that Gnosticism posed, and they responded with vigour. Beginning in the 2nd century, Christian bishops like Irenaeus of Lyons wrote lengthy refutations of Gnostic teachings, branding them as heresies that corrupted the true faith. By the 4th century, when Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire, the Church had the power not merely to condemn Gnostic ideas, but to physically suppress them. Gnostic texts were burned, Gnostic communities were dispersed, and Gnostic teachers were silenced. By the end of the 5th century, Gnosticism as an organised movement had effectively ceased to exist. But ideas, once conceived, never entirely die. The Gnostic vision of reality, its sense that the world we inhabit is somehow false or incomplete, that there exists behind the veil of appearances a higher, truer realm of light and spirit, would resurface again and again throughout history in medieval heresies, in Renaissance mysticism, in Romantic poetry, and in modern existential philosophy. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi codices allowed scholars, for the first time in more than a millennium, to hear the Gnostic voice directly, not filtered through the hostile accounts of their enemies, and to grapple with the profound and unsettling questions they had asked. What if the world is not what it seems? What if creation itself was a mistake? To understand how Gnosticism emerged, we must first understand the intellectual and spiritual ferment of the ancient Mediterranean world in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era. This was a time of tremendous cultural mixing when Greek philosophy, Jewish monotheism, and the various mystery religions of the East all collided and interpenetrated in the great cosmopolitan cities of the Roman Empire. And nowhere was this collision more intense than in Alexandria, Egypt. Alexandria in the 2nd century CE was the intellectual capital of the Roman world, a city of perhaps 500,000 people, with the greatest library of the ancient world and a reputation as a centre of learning that rivaled Athens itself. Founded by Alexander the Great in 31 BCE, the city had been designed from the beginning as a meeting place between East and West. Its population was extraordinarily diverse. Greeks and Macedonians, native Egyptians, Jews, Romans, Syrians, Persians, and merchants from as far away as India and Ethiopia. In its markets, one could hear a dozen languages spoken and see the symbols of a dozen different gods. This cultural diversity created an atmosphere of religious and philosophical experimentation. The old certainties of traditional religion were giving way to new questions, new doubts, new ways of thinking about the divine and the human. The educated classes of the Roman Empire were increasingly drawn to philosophical schools that promised not merely intellectual understanding, but spiritual transformation. Platonism, Stoicism, Pythagoreanism, and the various mystery cults imported from Egypt, Persia, and the Greek East. Into this ferment came Christianity, a new religious movement that had emerged from the Jewish communities of Palestine, but was rapidly spreading throughout the cities of the empire. Early Christianity was not yet the unified hierarchical institution it would later become. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, there were many different forms of Christianity, many different interpretations of who Jesus was and what his message meant. Some Christians emphasized his Jewish roots and insisted that his followers must observe the laws of Moses. Others, like Paul, argued that Jesus had inaugurated a new covenant that superseded the old law. Still others saw Jesus not as a historical figure who had lived and died in 1st century Palestine, but as a cosmic being, a divine revealer who had descended from the heavenly realm to bring saving knowledge to humanity. It was in this context that the Gnostic teachers emerged. Men like Valentinus, Basilides, and Carpocrates established schools in Alexandria and other major cities, where they taught their distinctive interpretations of Christian scripture and theology. These teachers were not uneducated fanatics or ignorant peasants. They were sophisticated intellectuals, well versed in Greek philosophy and Jewish scripture, capable of producing complex theological systems that rivaled anything produced by mainstream Christianity. Valentinus, the most influential of the Gnostic teachers, was born around 100 CE, possibly in the Nile Delta region of Egypt. He was educated in Alexandria, where he studied both Christian texts and Greek philosophy. Around 106 CE he moved to Rome, where he established a school and attracted a significant following. According to some accounts, he was even considered as a candidate for the office of Bishop of Rome, the position that would later evolve into the papacy. But Valentinus's teachings were too radical, too far removed from the emerging orthodoxy, and he was eventually expelled from the church. He returned to Cyprus, where he continued to teach until his death around 60 CE. What made Valentinus's teaching so controversial? At the heart of his system was a complex cosmology that described how the material world had come into being. According to Valentinus, the ultimate reality was an ineffable, transcendent God, far beyond human comprehension, dwelling in a realm of pure spirit and light called the pleroma, or fullness. From this God emanated a series of divine beings called aeons, arranged in male-female pairs or syzygies. These aeons were aspects or expressions of the divine nature, concepts like mind, truth, word, life, and wisdom. Sophia, whose name means wisdom, was the youngest of the aeons. In Valentinus's myth, Sophia became filled with a passionate desire to comprehend the transcendent Father directly, without the mediation of her male consort. This was an act of presumption, an attempt to grasp what was beyond her capacity to understand. The result was catastrophic. Sophia's desire gave birth to a formless, chaotic entity, a kind of spiritual abortion that was expelled from the pleroma into the void beyond. This malformed offspring of Sophia became the demiurge, the creator of the material world. In Valentinian mythology, the demiurge was not evil in an intentional sense, but rather ignorant and arrogant. Unaware of the higher realm of the pleroma from which he had been indirectly derived, the demiurge believed himself to be the only god, the supreme creator. It was this deluded being who created the material cosmos, fashioning it in imitation of the spiritual realm above, but producing only a pale, distorted copy. The identification of the demiurge with the God of the Hebrew Scriptures was unmistakable. When the demiurge declares, "I am God and there is none beside me," He's quoting the words of Yahweh from the book of Isaiah. For the Gnostics, this was not the voice of the true God, but the boast of an ignorant tyrant who had mistaken his own limited domain for the whole of reality. This was, to put it mildly, provocative. It suggested that the God worshipped by Jews and mainstream Christians was not the true God at all, but a false deity, a cosmic mistake. It inverted the entire structure of biblical religion, turning the Creator into a villain and the material world into a prison. Small wonder that the Church Fathers reacted with such hostility. Basilides, a contemporary of Valentinus who also taught in Alexandria, developed a somewhat different but equally elaborate Gnostic system. According to Basilides, the ultimate God had generated a series of increasingly material realms, each ruled by its own archon or ruler. The lowest of these realms was the material world, created and ruled by the archons who were ignorant of the higher realms above them. These archons were jealous and tyrannical, seeking to keep human souls trapped in matter and ignorant of their true divine origin. Carpocrates, another Alexandrian teacher, took Gnostic ideas in a more libertine direction, taught that because the material world and its laws were created by inferior archons, those who possessed gnosis were free to disregard moral laws and social conventions. The soul that had achieved liberation through knowledge was beyond good and evil, no longer bound by the arbitrary rules imposed by the archons. This teaching scandalized not only the Church Fathers, but also many other Gnostics, and it contributed to the popular image of Gnosticism as a licentious and antinomian movement. But not all Gnostics were libertines. Many, perhaps most, practiced a severe asceticism, viewing the body as a prison from which the soul must escape. If the material world was the creation of an evil or ignorant deity, then engagement with that world, including sexual reproduction, was a trap that perpetuated the imprisonment of divine light in matter. Some Gnostic groups practiced celibacy, fasting and other forms of bodily denial in an attempt to weaken the hold of matter over the spirit. The diversity of Gnostic teaching makes it difficult to speak of a single unified Gnostic movement. The term Gnosticism itself is a modern scholarly construct, an umbrella category that covers a wide range of different groups and teachers who shared certain family resemblances but differed in many specifics. What united them was a dualistic worldview that sharply distinguished between spirit and matter, between the true God and the false creator, between the divine spark within and the alien prison of the body. And what united them was the belief that salvation came not through faith or works, but through gnosis, a direct mystical knowledge of one's true divine nature. This emphasis on direct knowledge had profound implications for religious authority and social structure. The mainstream church was developing an increasingly hierarchical organization, with bishops claiming apostolic succession and the exclusive right to interpret scripture and administer the sacraments. The Gnostics, by contrast, tended toward a more egalitarian and experiential spirituality. If salvation came through direct personal gnosis, then every individual who achieved that gnosis was in some sense a spiritual authority. There was no need for priests to mediate between the individual and the divine, no need for bishops to define orthodoxy. Moreover, Gnostic groups were more likely to grant women positions of spiritual authority. In the Gospel of Mary, one of the texts found at Nag Hammadi, Mary Magdalene is portrayed as Jesus' most insightful disciple, the one to whom he entrusts his deepest teachings. When Peter objects that Jesus would not have shared such knowledge with a woman, Levi rebukes him. If the Saviour made her worthy, who are you to reject her? This was a radical challenge to the patriarchal structure of both Roman society and the emerging church. The Gnostic vision was, in short, a threat to every form of established authority, religious, political, and social. It questioned the goodness of creation and therefore the authority of the Creator. It questioned the validity of divine law and therefore the authority of those who claimed to speak in God's name. It questioned the permanence of social hierarchies and therefore the authority of those who benefited from them. It is no wonder that the powers of both church and empire eventually moved to suppress it. To fully grasp the Gnostic critique of reality, we need to examine in more detail the cosmology they constructed, the elaborate mythological system through which they explained how the world came to be and why it was flawed. At the heart of this cosmology was the figure of Sophia, divine wisdom, whose error set in motion the chain of events that led to the creation of the material world. The myth of Sophia exists in several different versions, preserved in various Gnostic texts. One of the most detailed accounts is found in the Apocryphon of John, also known as the Secret Book of John, a text that was among the codices discovered at Nag Hammadi. According to this text, Sophia was the last and youngest of the aeons emanated from the Father, the transcendent God who dwells in the Pleroma. The aeons existed in perfect harmony, contemplating the Father and reflecting his glory, but Sophia, moved by love for the Father, desired to produce something by herself, without the consent of the Father and without the cooperation of her male consort. She wanted to create an image of herself to bring forth something from her own contemplation of the divine. This desire was not evil, but it was misguided. Sophia's action violated the principle of syzygy, the divine pairing of masculine and feminine that maintained balance and order in the Pleroma. The result of Sophia's solitary act of creation was catastrophic. Because she acted without her consort, without the masculine principle, her offspring was defective and malformed. What she brought forth was not a perfect aeon, but a monstrous creature, twisted and ignorant, a being that one text describes as having the face of a lion and the body of a serpent, with eyes flashing like lightning. This creature was the Demiurge, whom the Gnostics also called Yaldabaoth, which may mean child of chaos or begetter of the abyss. Horrified by what she had produced, Sophia cast the Demiurge away from the Pleroma into the lower regions of darkness and void. There, cut off from the light and knowledge of the divine realm, Yaldabaoth would create his own kingdom. But Sophia's error had another consequence. In giving birth to the Demiurge, she had expended a portion of her own divine substance, her own spiritual light. This light, this fragment of the divine, was now trapped in the lower regions, mingled with the chaos and darkness. It would be this divine spark that would later become the basis of the human soul, the higher self that yearns to return to its source. Meanwhile, in the darkness below the Pleroma, the Demiurge began to create. Unaware of the higher realm from which he had indirectly come, Yaldabaoth believed himself to be the only god, the supreme creator. In his arrogance and ignorance, he declared, "I am God and there is none beside me, and success tumnisa." Then, using his own limited powers and imitating the structure of the Pleroma, which he perceived only dimly and imperfectly, he began to fashion a material cosmos. First, Yaldabaoth created the Archons, a host of lesser rulers who would govern the different spheres of his created cosmos. In most Gnostic systems, there were 7 primary Archons, corresponding to the 7 planets known to ancient astronomy: the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. These Archons were given names that often parodied or inverted the names of the Hebrew god and his angels: Saklas, Fool, Samael, Blind God, and so on. Together, the Demiurge and the Archons fashioned the material world. They created the 4 elements: earth, water, air, and fire. They created time and space, the sun and the moon, the stars and the planets. They created plants and animals. And finally, they created humanity. But the creation of humanity was complicated by the presence of that divine spark that had fallen from Sophia. According to the Apocryphon of John, when the Archons created the first human, Adam, they fashioned only a body which lay lifeless on the ground. The Archons themselves possessed no true spiritual power, only the imitative ability to shape matter. But the forces of the Pleroma, seeking to recover the divine light that had fallen, tricked the Demiurge into breathing his own pneuma, his own spirit, into the human form. When he did so, the divine spark that he had unwittingly received from Sophia passed into Adam, and the human came to life, The result was a being of dual nature. The human body and its animal soul were the creation of the archons, products of the material world and subject to its laws. But hidden within, deeper than the body and the animal soul, was the pneuma, the spirit, the divine spark that had fallen from the pleroma. This spark was the true self, the essence of the human being, and it retained a dim memory of its origin in the realm of light. The demiurge and the archons, recognizing that the human possessed something they could not fully control, became alarmed. They resolved to keep humanity in a state of ignorance, preventing humans from discovering their true nature and origin. In the Gnostic reading of Genesis, the tree of knowledge of good and evil was not a temptation to disobedience but an offer of liberation. When the serpent told Eve that eating from the tree would make her like God, the serpent was actually an agent of the higher powers, revealing the truth that the demiurge wanted to keep hidden. The prohibition against eating from the tree was not divine law, but tyrannical control, an attempt to prevent humanity from awakening to its true nature. This interpretation of the Genesis story inverted all of its traditional meanings. The serpent became the hero, the revealer of truth. The demiurge became the villain, the jealous tyrant who wanted to keep humanity enslaved in ignorance. The expulsion from Eden was not a punishment for sin, but the beginning of humanity's entrapment in the material world. And the entire subsequent history of the Hebrew Bible, with its laws and commandments, its sacrifices and rituals, was revealed as the system of control imposed by the false god to maintain his tyranny. The archons, according to Gnostic teaching, continued to rule over the material cosmos, each governing one of the planetary spheres through which the soul must pass on its journey from Earth to the pleroma. These spheres formed a series of barriers or checkpoints, and at each one, the archons would attempt to prevent the soul from ascending. Only those who possessed the correct knowledge, the secret passwords and formulae revealed in Gnostic texts, could successfully navigate these barriers and return to their true home. This cosmology bears a striking resemblance to the astronomical model of Ptolemy, which was the standard understanding of the universe in the ancient world. According to Ptolemaic astronomy, the Earth was surrounded by a series of crystalline spheres, each carrying one of the 7 planets. Beyond the planetary spheres lay the sphere of the fixed stars, and beyond that, some philosophers posited, lay higher realms of pure intellect and spirit. The Gnostics took this astronomical model and infused it with spiritual and moral significance. Each sphere was not just a physical region, but a domain of power and control, ruled by hostile forces that sought to keep the soul trapped in matter. The metaphor of imprisonment runs throughout Gnostic literature. The body is described as a tomb, the soul as a prisoner, the world as a cage or a dungeon. One Gnostic text, the Exegesis on the Soul, describes the soul's fall into the body in terms that evoke sexual violation, portraying the soul as a virgin who is seduced and corrupted by the material world. Another text, the Hymn of the Pearl, tells the story of a prince who is sent from his homeland to recover a precious pearl from Egypt, but who becomes intoxicated by the food and drink of that foreign land and forgets his identity and mission, until a letter from his father awakens him to remember who he truly is. This theme of forgetting and remembering is central to Gnostic spirituality. The human condition is defined by amnesia, a forgetting of one's true origin and nature. We have forgotten that we are divine beings, sparks of light from the pleroma, and have mistaken ourselves for mere material creatures, products of the demiurge's flawed creation. The Gnostic path of salvation consists in remembering, in recovering that lost knowledge of who we truly are. But this remembering cannot come from ordinary learning or rational thought. It requires a special revelation, a message from the higher realm that can penetrate the barriers erected by the archons. In Christian Gnostic systems, this revealer is identified with Christ, understood not as the historical Jesus of Nazareth, but as a cosmic being, an aeon from the pleroma who descended into the material world to bring saving knowledge to humanity. His crucifixion in this reading was not a sacrificial atonement for sin, but an illusion, a deception of the archons who could not truly harm a spiritual being. What mattered was not his death, but his teaching, the gnosis he imparted to his disciples. The Gnostic Christ is a teacher of mysteries, a revealer of hidden knowledge. In the Gospel of Thomas, one of the most significant texts found at Nag Hammadi, Jesus speaks almost entirely in enigmatic sayings and riddles, many of which seem designed to shock the hearer into a new way of seeing. If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. The emphasis is entirely on interior realization, on the discovery of the divine spark within oneself. This interiorization of spirituality had profound implications. If the divine was to be found within, not in external authorities or institutions, then each individual was, in a sense, autonomous in their spiritual journey. The Church, with its bishops and priests, its sacraments and dogmas, was unnecessary, perhaps even an obstacle. The Gnostics were their own priests, their own mediators with the divine. This was spiritual democracy of the most radical kind, and it posed an existential threat to the hierarchical structure that the mainstream church was building. By the middle of the 2nd century, the diversity of early Christianity had become a problem. As the church grew and spread throughout the Roman Empire, the lack of any unified doctrine or centralized authority made it vulnerable to fragmentation and confusion. Different teachers were offering wildly different interpretations of who Jesus was and what his message meant. Some taught that Jesus was fully divine and only appeared to have a human body. Others taught that he was fully human and was adopted by God at his baptism. Still others, like the Gnostics, taught that Jesus was a cosmic revealer from a higher realm, neither fully divine nor fully human in any conventional sense. The leaders of what would become mainstream or orthodox Christianity recognized that this diversity threatened the coherence and survival of the movement. If Christianity was to establish itself as a unified religion capable of rivaling the traditional Roman cults, it needed clear boundaries, definite doctrines, and recognized authorities. It needed, in short, to define what was orthodox, correct belief, and what was heretical, false teaching. The great heresy hunters of the 2nd and 3rd centuries were bishops and theologians who took upon themselves the task of refuting false teachings and establishing orthodoxy. Chief among them was Irenaeus, who became Bishop of Lyon in Gaul around 178 CE. Irenaeus had been born in Asia Minor and had studied under Polycarp, who was said to have been a disciple of the Apostle John. This gave Irenaeus a claim to apostolic succession, a direct link back to the original followers of Jesus, which he used to establish his authority. Around 180 CE, Irenaeus wrote his most important work, Against Heresies, a massive 5-volume refutation of Gnostic teaching. The full title of the work was On the Detection and Overthrow of the so-called Gnosis, and it lived up to that title. Irenaeus systematically described and then dismantled the various Gnostic systems, exposing what he saw as their logical inconsistencies, their absurd mythology, and their dangerous moral implications. Irenaeus was particularly alarmed by the Valentinian system, which he described in detail before refuting it. He mocked the elaborate cosmology of aeons and emanations, asking why there should be exactly 30 aeons in the pleroma rather than some other number, and suggesting that the entire system was a product of arbitrary human invention rather than divine revelation. He ridiculed the myth of Sophia, calling it an absurd fable unworthy of the dignity of God. And he argued that the Gnostic reading of Genesis, which portrayed the Creator as a false god, was a blasphemous inversion of Scripture. But Irenaeus' critique went deeper than mere mockery. He argued that Gnosticism fundamentally misunderstood the nature of God and creation. The God of the Bible, Irenaeus insisted, was not a remote, unknowable, transcendent being separated from creation by layers of emanations. Rather, God was intimately involved with his creation, loving it and guiding it toward its ultimate fulfillment. The creation of the material world was not an error or a catastrophe, but the good and intentional act. Matter itself was not evil or inferior, but was created by God and was therefore fundamentally good. Moreover, Irenaeus argued that the incarnation of Christ in a real, physical body was essential to Christian belief. Against the Gnostic claim that Jesus only appeared to have a body, Irenaeus insisted that Jesus was truly human, that he was born, lived, suffered, and died in a real physical body. This was important because, according to Irenaeus, Christ's mission was not merely to bring knowledge, but to heal and redeem fallen humanity. He became what we are so that we might become what he is, Irenaeus wrote. If Christ did not truly assume human flesh, then human flesh could not be saved. Irenaeus also attacked the Gnostic claim to possess secret knowledge handed down from Jesus to select disciples. Against this, Irenaeus argued for the principle of apostolic succession. The true teaching of Jesus, he claimed, had been publicly proclaimed by the apostles and handed down through the bishops of the church, who formed an unbroken chain of succession going back to the apostles themselves. There was no need for secret knowledge or hidden gospels. Everything necessary for salvation had been openly taught and was preserved in the public tradition of the church. To support this argument, Irenaeus compiled what may have been the first list of books that should be considered authoritative Christian scripture. This list included the 4 Gospels that would eventually become part of the New Testament canon: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Irenaeus argued that there could be only 4 Gospels, just as there were 4 corners of the earth and 4 winds of heaven. Any other Gospels, including the various Gnostic Gospels, were spurious and not to be trusted. This process of defining a biblical canon was crucial to the Church's campaign against Gnosticism. By establishing which books were authoritative and which were not, the Church could exclude Gnostic texts from the definition of legitimate scripture. By insisting on the public apostolic tradition, the Church could delegitimize the Gnostic claim to secret knowledge. And by developing a clear creedal statement of belief, the Church could define who was inside the community and who was outside. Other Church fathers joined Irenaeus in the fight against Gnosticism. Tertullian, writing in North Africa around 200 CE, attacked the Gnostics for their endless mythological speculation, which he saw as a distraction from simple faith. "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" Tertullian demanded, rejecting the Greek philosophical influences that had shaped Gnostic thought. Hippolytus of Rome wrote his own refutation of heresies, attempting to trace all Gnostic ideas back to Greek philosophy and thereby prove that they were not genuinely Christian. Even those church fathers who were more sympathetic to philosophical inquiry joined in condemning Gnosticism. Clement of Alexandria, who was himself trained in Greek philosophy and believed that it could serve as a preparation for Christian faith, nevertheless rejected Gnostic teachings as the distortion of both philosophy and Christianity. His student Origen, who was perhaps the most philosophically sophisticated of all the church fathers, wrote extensively against the Gnostics, while at the same time developing his own complex theological system that borrowed some elements from Gnostic cosmology, such as the pre-existence of souls and the idea of multiple levels of spiritual reality. But it was not only through theological argument that the Church opposed Gnosticism. As Christianity became more powerful and more closely aligned with the Roman state, it acquired the ability to use coercion and force. In 313 CE, the Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, which legalized Christianity and ended the persecution of Christians by the Roman authorities. By 387 CE, under the Emperor Theodosius, Christianity had become the official religion of the empire, and other religions were outlawed. This transformation of Christianity from a persecuted minority to an imperial power had profound consequences for the treatment of dissent within the Christian community. What had once been resolved through debate and persuasion could now be settled through legal penalties and physical force. Bishops who were deemed heretical could be removed from their positions by imperial decree. Books deemed heretical could be ordered destroyed by law. Communities that refused to accept orthodox teaching could be dispersed and their property confiscated. In 3 CE, Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria, issued his 39th festal letter, which was sent to all the churches under his authority. In this letter, Athanasius listed the books that should be considered canonical scripture and ordered that all other books, particularly Gnostic texts, be removed from churches and destroyed. It was probably in response to this order that the monks of Ptomius' monastery near Nag Hammadi gathered their collection of Gnostic codices, placed them in a sealed jar, and buried them in the cliff where they would remain hidden for 1500 years. The suppression of Gnosticism was remarkably thorough. By the end of the 5th century, Gnosticism as an organised movement had ceased to exist within the boundaries of the Roman Empire. The names of the great Gnostic teachers like Valentinus and Basilides were remembered only in the refutations of the Church Fathers. Their texts were lost or existed only in fragmentary quotations in Orthodox sources. The Gnostic communities that had flourished in Alexandria, Rome, and other major cities disappeared, their members either conforming to Orthodox teaching or falling into silence. But the Gnostic vision did not entirely vanish. It would resurface in modified forms in later religious movements that the Church would also condemn as heresies. In the 3rd century Mani, a Persian prophet, founded Manichaeism, a dualistic religion that shared many features with Gnosticism, including the belief that the material world was created by an evil power and that salvation came through knowledge. Manichaeism spread rapidly throughout the Roman Empire and beyond, reaching as far as China. For a time, even Augustine of Hippo, who would become one of the most influential theologians in Christian history, was a Manichaean before his conversion to Orthodox Christianity. In the Middle Ages, dualistic heresies emerged in various parts of Europe. The Bogomils in the Balkans and the Cathars in southern France taught doctrines strikingly similar to ancient Gnosticism, rejecting the material world as evil and seeking liberation through ascetic practice and spiritual knowledge. The Church responded with crusades and inquisitions, and by the 14th century these movements too had been suppressed. But the fundamental questions that the Gnostics had raised would not go away. Is the world we inhabit the best of all possible worlds, created by a benevolent God? Or is it flawed, fallen, perhaps even evil? Is matter something to be celebrated and affirmed, or something to be transcended and escaped? Is salvation a matter of correct belief and moral behaviour, or is it a matter of direct mystical knowledge? These questions would continue to haunt Western religious and philosophical thought, sometimes openly, sometimes in disguised forms, down to the present day. For more than 1,000 years after the burial of the Nag Hammadi codices, Gnostic texts existed only as fragments, preserved in the hostile quotations of their orthodox opponents. The names of Gnostic teachers were known, their ideas were vaguely remembered, but their actual writings were lost. If you wanted to know what Valentinus or Basilides had actually taught, you had to rely on the accounts of Irenaeus or Hippolytus, accounts written by men who had every reason to distort and misrepresent Gnostic ideas in order to make them appear as ridiculous and dangerous as possible. Yet the Gnostic vision survived, transmuted into new forms, embedded in traditions that the Church could not entirely suppress. The emphasis on direct mystical experience, on the soul's journey toward union with the divine, on the corrupt nature of the material world and the need for spiritual liberation, all these themes continue to appear in various mystical and esoteric movements throughout the medieval and early modern periods. Manichaeism, the dualistic religion founded by the Persian prophet Mani in the 3rd century, preserved many Gnostic themes. Mani taught that the world was the product of a cosmic battle between the forces of light and darkness, and that the human soul was a spark of light trapped in the kingdom of darkness. Salvation came through knowledge and ascetic practice, particularly vegetarianism and celibacy, which weakened the hold of darkness over the soul. Manichaeism spread rapidly, establishing communities from Spain to China, and for several centuries it was one of the major religions of the ancient world. But Manichaeism faced persecution from both the Christian Church and the Persian Zoroastrian establishment. In the Roman Empire, the Emperor Diocletian issued an edict in 227 CE, ordering Manichaean books burned and Manichaeans themselves to be executed. After Constantine legalized Christianity, Christian emperors continued this persecution, and by the 6th century, Manichaeism had largely disappeared from the West. It survived longer in the East, particularly in Central Asia, but by the 14th century it had vanished there as well, suppressed by both Muslim and Mongol rulers. Yet the dualistic vision persisted. In the 10th century, a new dualistic movement emerged in the Balkans. The Bogomils, whose name may mean beloved of God, taught that the material world had been created by Satan, whom they identified as the demiurge. Like the ancient Gnostics, the Bogomils rejected the authority of the established church, refused to worship icons or relics, and practiced an ascetic lifestyle. They spread throughout the Byzantine Empire and influenced religious movements in Western Europe. The most significant of these Western movements was Catharism, which flourished in southern France, particularly into the region of Languedoc, from the 12th to the 14th centuries. The Cathars, whose name derives from the Greek word for pure, were divided into two classes: the Perfecti, who had received a special initiation called the Consolamentum, and were expected to live lives of strict asceticism, and the Credentes, ordinary believers who supported the Perfecti but were not expected to observe such rigorous discipline. Cathar theology was explicitly dualistic. They taught that the material world was the creation of an evil god, whom they sometimes identified with Satan or the demiurge, while the spiritual realm was the domain of the good God. The human soul was a spark of divine light trapped in matter, and salvation meant escaping the cycle of reincarnation and returning to the spiritual realm. They rejected the Old Testament, seeing it as the work of the evil creator God, and they interpreted the New Testament in a highly spiritual sense, claiming that Jesus had not really been crucified in a physical body. The Church viewed Catharism as a mortal threat. Not only did it challenge Christian doctrine, but it also offered an alternative religious structure, complete with its own hierarchy and rituals, that competed with the Church for the loyalty of the people. In 1209, Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade, a military campaign against the Cathars that lasted for 2 decades and resulted in the devastation of much of southern France. The crusade was followed by the establishment of the Inquisition, which systematically hunted down and executed remaining Cathars. By the early 14th century, Catharism had been effectively exterminated. But even as the Church was suppressing dualistic heresies, elements of the Gnostic worldview were being preserved and transmitted through more acceptable channels. Christian mysticism, while remaining within the bounds of orthodoxy, often emphasized themes that echoed Gnostic spirituality: the soul's ascent to God, the need to transcend the material world, the importance of direct experiential knowledge of the divine. In the 12th century, Hildegard of Bingen, a German abbess and mystic, described visions in which she saw the cosmos as a vast structure of concentric spheres, with the material world at the center and increasingly spiritual realms radiating outward. Her descriptions of Sophia, divine wisdom, as a feminine aspect of God who participated in creation bore striking resemblances to the Gnostic myth, though Hildegard remained firmly within Christian orthodoxy by insisting that the creation was good and that Sophia had not fallen. In Jewish mysticism, the development of Kabbalah in medieval Spain and Provence introduced ideas that paralleled Gnostic cosmology. The Kabbalistic system of the Sephirot, 10 divine emanations through which God manifests in creation, resembled the Gnostic system of aeons. The Kabbalistic concept of the Shekinah, the feminine aspect of God who is in exile in the material world and longs to return to unity with the divine, echoed the myth of Sophia. And the Kabbalistic practice of seeking mystical knowledge of God's hidden nature through meditation on sacred texts and divine names paralleled the Gnostic emphasis on gnosis. Islamic mysticism, or Sufism, also developed themes that resonated with Gnostic spirituality. Sufi teachers spoke of the soul's journey through spiritual stations toward union with God, of the need to strip away the false self and discover the true divine essence within, of the material world as a veil that obscures ultimate reality. Some Sufi poets, like the 13th century Persian mystic Rumi, described the soul's longing to return to its source in language that could have come from a Gnostic text. I died as a mineral and became a plant. I died as plant and rose to animal. I died as animal. And I was man. Why should I fear? When was I less by dying? In the Renaissance, with the rediscovery of ancient philosophical texts and the development of Hermeticism and Neoplatonism, ideas that bore a family resemblance to Gnosticism found new expression among European intellectuals. The Hermetic texts, which were attributed to an ancient Egyptian sage named Hermes Trismegistus, but were actually composed in the early centuries of the Common Era, shared with Gnosticism the idea that the material world was a fallen realm and that salvation came through mystical knowledge. Renaissance philosophers like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola studied these texts alongside Plato and the Kabbalists, creating a syncretic mystical philosophy that influenced art, literature, and science. In the 17th century, the German mystic Jakob Böhme developed a Christian theosophy that incorporated dualistic themes. Böhme taught that God contains within himself a dark, chaotic principle, as well as a principle of light and order, and that the creation of the world involved a fall or division within the divine nature itself. Though Böhme's ideas were controversial and were condemned by some Lutheran authorities, they influenced later German philosophy, particularly German idealism. The English poet and artist William Blake, writing in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, drew on a wide range of esoteric sources, including Gnosticism, to create his own elaborate mythology. Blake's figure of Urizen, the tyrannical creator who imposes laws and limits on human imagination, clearly parallels the Gnostic demiurge. Blake's insistence that the material world as we perceive it is a fallen, limited version of a higher reality, and that salvation comes through imaginative vision that can see through the veil of appearance, echoes Gnostic themes. But all of these were indirect transmissions, influences filtered through other traditions, ideas refracted through different lenses. No one in the medieval or early modern periods had direct access to actual Gnostic texts. The Gnostic voice itself remained sullen, buried in the Egyptian desert, waiting to be heard again. The Enlightenment of the 18th century brought a fundamental shift in how educated Europeans thought about religion and the world. The rise of modern science, with its mechanistic account of nature, challenged traditional religious cosmologies. The development of historical criticism raised questions about the reliability of scripture and religious tradition. And the religious wars that had devastated Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries had created a deep skepticism about the claims of any religious authority to possess absolute truth. In this context, some Enlightenment thinkers began to ask uncomfortable questions that echoed, in secular terms, the ancient Gnostic critique. If God is all-powerful and all-good, why does the world contain so much evil and suffering? Is this really the best of all possible worlds? The German philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, in his Theodicy of 1710, had argued that it was, that God had created the world in which the greatest possible good is achieved with the least possible evil. But this argument satisfied few people, and it was savagely mocked by Voltaire in his satirical novel Candide. Published in 1759, Candide tells the story of a naive young man who has been taught by his tutor, Dr. Pangloss, that all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. Candide then experiences or witnesses an escalating series of horrors: war, earthquake, disease, rape, torture, all of which Pangloss continues to explain away with increasingly absurd rationalizations. Voltaire's message was clear. The actual world we inhabit, with its appalling cruelty and meaningless suffering, cannot plausibly be the work of a benevolent and omnipotent creator. Though Voltaire was not a Gnostic and probably knew little about ancient Gnosticism, his critique raised the same question that had troubled the Gnostics. What if the world is fundamentally flawed? What if creation itself is the problem? The Gnostics had answered this question by positing a false creator, an ignorant demiurge who had botched the job. The Enlightenment skeptics answered it by questioning whether there was a creator at all, or at least whether that creator had the attributes that traditional religion claimed. But it was not only philosophical skeptics who were raising these questions. Some Christian theologians and biblical scholars were beginning to apply historical and critical methods to the study of Scripture, and their findings were unsettling. They discovered that the Bible was not a unified, consistent text dictated by God, but a collection of documents written by different authors at different times, reflecting different and sometimes contradictory theological perspectives. They found that many stories in the Bible were similar to myths from other ancient cultures, suggesting that the biblical authors had borrowed and adapted these stories rather than receiving unique divine revelation. And they began to question whether the historical Jesus of Nazareth bore much resemblance to the Christ of Orthodox Christian doctrine. In 1835, the German scholar David Friedrich Strauss published The Life of Jesus Critically Examined, a book that sent shockwaves through European Christianity. Strauss argued that the Gospels were not historical documents but mythological narratives constructed by the early Christian community to express their faith in Jesus as the Messiah. The miracles, the resurrection, the divine nature of Jesus, all these, Strauss suggested, were myths, not historical facts. What could be recovered of the historical Jesus was simply a Jewish teacher who had been executed by the Romans. This historical critical approach to the Bible opened up new questions about the origins of Christianity. If the Gospels were not straightforward historical accounts, then what other versions of Christianity might have existed in the earliest period? What other interpretations of Jesus might have been possible before the Church settled on orthodoxy? Scholars began to look with new interest at the references in the Church Fathers to various heretical groups and teachers, wondering what these suppressed voices might have said if they had not been silenced. In the 19th century, a few Gnostic texts began to surface. In 1769, a Coptic manuscript had been purchased in Egypt and eventually ended up in the Askew Codex in the British Museum. This manuscript contained a Gnostic text called Pistis Sophia, which described the adventures of Sophia after her fall and the teachings of Jesus to his disciples after the resurrection. In 1896, another Coptic Gnostic manuscript, the Berlin Codex, was purchased in Egypt. It contained several texts, including the Gospel of Mary and the Apocryphon of John. These manuscripts were slowly translated and published, giving scholars their first direct look at Gnostic literature in nearly 2,000 years. The effect was startling. Here, finally, was the Gnostic voice speaking for itself, not filtered through the hostile accounts of the Church Fathers. And what that voice said was strange, beautiful, and deeply unsettling. The Gnostic texts revealed a form of Christianity that was radically different from the Orthodox tradition, a Christianity that emphasized mystical knowledge over institutional authority, that gave women prominent roles as teachers and disciples, that questioned the goodness of creation and the authority of the Creator. The German scholar Adolf von Harnack, writing at the turn of the 20th century, described Gnosticism as the acute Hellenization of Christianity. By this he meant that the Gnostics had taken the Jewish message of Jesus and thoroughly transformed it according to Greek philosophical categories, particularly Platonism. Harnack saw this as a corruption of the original Christian message, but he acknowledged that Gnosticism represented a serious and sophisticated attempt to make sense of Christian faith in terms of the philosophical questions of the ancient world. Other scholars were less judgmental. The Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, whose work we will explore in more detail later, became fascinated by Gnosticism in the early 20th century. Jung saw in Gnostic mythology a profound psychological truth, a symbolic representation of the structure of the unconscious mind and the process of psychological integration. He began to collect and study Gnostic texts, and they would deeply influence his later psychological theories. The French scholar Jean Jaurès, who was one of the first to examine the Nag Hammadi codices in the 1940s, approached them with a sense of wonder. Here were texts that had been hidden for 15 centuries, preserved by the dry Egyptian climate, waiting to be read again. As the texts were translated, it became clear that they represented a major discovery for the understanding of early Christianity. The Nag Hammadi library included not only texts that had been mentioned by the Church Fathers and were now recovered in full, like the Apocryphon of John, but also texts that had been completely unknown, like the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas was particularly significant. Unlike the canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are narratives describing the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, the Gospel of Thomas is simply a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus, with minimal narrative framework. Some of these sayings are similar or identical to sayings found in the canonical Gospels, but others are unique to Thomas and often have a distinctly Gnostic flavour. Jesus said, "If they say to you, 'Where have you come from?' say to them, 'We have come from the light, from the place where the light came into being by itself.' If they say to you, 'Who are you?' say, 'We are its children, and we are the chosen of the living Father.'" The discovery of the Gospel of Thomas raised the possibility that there had been a sayings tradition in early Christianity, independent of the narrative Gospels, and that this tradition might preserve some authentic teachings of Jesus. Scholars debated whether Thomas was earlier or later than the canonical Gospels, whether it was dependent on them or independent, whether it represented a form of Christianity that predated the development of Orthodox theology, or whether it was a later, more developed form that had moved away from the original message. These debates are still ongoing, but what was clear was that the Nag Hammadi discovery had fundamentally changed our understanding of early Christianity. It was no longer possible to see orthodoxy as the original pure form of Christianity from which heresies had later departed. Instead, it appeared that there had been a wide diversity of Christianities in the 1st and 2nd centuries, and that orthodoxy was simply the version that had won out, backed by institutional power and imperial authority. The Gnostics were not departing from an established truth, but were participants in an open debate about what Christianity should be, a debate that was only closed by force. No one did more to revive interest in Gnosticism in the 20th century than the Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung. Jung's encounter with Gnostic texts was a turning point in his intellectual development, shaping his understanding of the unconscious mind and giving him a language to describe psychological experiences that he believed could not be adequately explained by the scientific psychology of his time. Jung first became seriously interested in Gnosticism around 1916, during a period of intense psychological crisis. After his break with Sigmund Freud, Jung had entered what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period during which he experienced powerful visions and fantasies that seemed to emerge from depths of his psyche beyond his conscious control. He recorded these experiences in what would later be published as the Red Book, a large illuminated manuscript filled with strange images and cryptic text. As Jung tried to make sense of these experiences, he began to read widely in religious and mystical literature, searching for parallels to what he had undergone. It was in Gnostic texts that he found the closest resemblance. The Gnostic myths of the divine spark trapped in matter, of Sophia's fall and redemption, of the soul's journey through hostile archonic powers. All these seemed to Jung to be symbolic representations of psychological processes he had experienced himself. Jung came to believe that Gnostic mythology was not simply ancient religious speculation, but was a kind of proto-psychology, an attempt to describe the structure and dynamics of the human psyche using the language of myth and symbol. The pleroma represented the collective unconscious, the deep impersonal layer of the psyche that contains the archetypes, the universal patterns of human experience. The demiurge and the archons represented what Jung would call the shadow, the dark, rejected aspects of the personality that take on autonomous power when they are not acknowledged. Sophia represented the anima, the feminine aspect of the male psyche, whose development and integration was essential to psychological wholeness. Jung's interpretation of Gnosticism was psychological rather than historical or theological. He was not interested in whether Gnostic cosmology was literally true, whether there really was a pleroma or a demiurge. What interested him was the psychological meaning of these symbols, what they revealed about the human experience of the unconscious mind. In a seminar he gave on the Gnostic text, The Visions of Zosimos, in the 1930s, Jung argued that the alchemical and Gnostic emphasis on transformation represented the psychological process of individuation, the integration of the conscious and unconscious aspects of the personality into a unified whole. The Gnostic language of light trapped in darkness, of the divine spark imprisoned in matter, was, in Jung's reading, a symbolic description of the consciousness that has become identified with the ego and has lost touch with the deeper sources of the self. Jung saw a parallel between the Gnostic vision of a flawed creation ruled by an ignorant demiurge and what he called the problem of the shadow. The shadow consists of those aspects of ourselves that we do not wish to acknowledge, the dark, inferior, primitive sides of our personality that we repress and project onto others. When we deny the shadow, it does not disappear but becomes autonomous, acting as an inner tyrant that distorts our perception and controls our behaviour without our awareness. The Gnostic demiurge, in this reading, was a symbol of the shadow that has been given the power of a god, a rejected part of the self that has become inflated and now rules the inner world. Sophia's fall represented the descent of consciousness into identification with matter, with the physical body and the external world. Her longing to return to the pleroma represented the psyche's yearning for wholeness, for reconnection with the deeper sources of being. And the gnosis that brings salvation was psychological insight, the self-knowledge that allows the conscious ego to recognize its deeper identity with the self, the totality of the psyche. Jung's psychological interpretation of Gnosticism was influential, but also controversial. Some scholars of religion objected that Jung was reading modern psychological concepts back into ancient texts, distorting their original meaning. The Gnostics, these scholars argued, were not doing psychology but theology. They really believed in a cosmic drama involving divine beings, not in symbolic representations of psychological processes. But Jung's defenders argued that he was simply translating the language of ancient myth into modern psychological terms, that he was recognizing the same human experiences described in different vocabularies. Whether one spoke of Sophia's fall or of the descent of consciousness into identification with the ego, one was describing the same psychological reality. The language was different, but the underlying experience was the same. Jung's interest in Gnosticism intensified after the discovery of the Nag Hammadi codices. When he learned of the find in the late 1940s, he was eager to obtain copies of the texts and arrange for their translation. In fact, one of the Nag Hammadi codices, Codex Wen, was purchased by the Jung Institute in Zurich and later given to the Coptic Museum in Cairo. It is sometimes called the Jung Codex in his honour. Jung wrote about Gnosticism in several of his later works, particularly an answer to Job published in 1952. In this strange and controversial book, Jung offered a psychological interpretation of the biblical book of Job, arguing that God's treatment of Job revealed a dark, unconscious side of the divine nature that needed to be integrated and made conscious. Jung suggested that the incarnation of Christ represented God's attempt to become conscious of his own shadow, but that this process remained incomplete. The Gnostic insight that the Creator was not the highest God, but a flawed or evil demiurge, was, in Jung's view, a recognition of this dark side of the divine. This was provocative stuff, and it earned Jung criticism from both Christian theologians and academic scholars. But it also resonated with many people in the mid-20th century who were searching for a spirituality that did not require belief in traditional religious doctrines, that emphasized inner experience over outer authority, and that could integrate insights from psychology and comparative religion. For these seekers, Jung's psychological interpretation of Gnosticism offered a way to take ancient spiritual wisdom seriously, without having to accept its literal metaphysical claims. Beyond Jung, other psychologists and psychotherapists found in Gnostic themes a language for describing certain psychological experiences and conditions. The sense of alienation, of not belonging to this world, of being a stranger in a strange land, is a common human experience, particularly among adolescents and artists, and the Gnostic myth of the divine spark trapped in hostile matter provided a symbolic expression of this feeling. The Gnostic emphasis on waking up, on remembering who you truly are, paralleled the therapeutic goal of bringing unconscious material into consciousness, of recognizing the ways in which we are controlled by unacknowledged forces within ourselves. The Gnostic journey through the archonic spheres could be read as the process of working through psychological complexes, each ruled by its own internal tyrant, each demanding its own form of knowledge or password to be traversed. Some therapists working with patients who described experiences of ritual abuse or mind control noted similarities to Gnostic descriptions of archonic control and imprisonment. While controversy surrounded the historical reality of such abuse, the Gnostic language provided a way for patients to articulate experiences of violation, entrapment, and loss of agency that felt spiritually as well as psychologically true. The rise of transpersonal psychology in the 60s and 70s, with its interest in mystical states, altered consciousness, and spiritual dimensions of human experience, found in Gnosticism a rich source of symbolic language and conceptual frameworks. Researchers studying psychedelic experiences noted that subjects often reported encounters with entities or realms that resembled Gnostic descriptions of archons and spiritual spheres. Whether these were objective encounters with non-physical realities or symbolic representations of psychological processes remained a matter of debate, but the Gnostic framework provided a way to interpret and integrate such experiences. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, an unexpected convergence occurred between ancient Gnostic ideas and cutting-edge physics and philosophy of mind. While no one was claiming that the Gnostics had literally been right about the structure of the cosmos, some contemporary thinkers noted striking parallels between Gnostic cosmology and modern scientific theories about the nature of reality. The Gnostic vision of multiple levels of reality, with the material world as the lowest and densest level, and increasingly subtle spiritual realms extending beyond it, bore a curious resemblance to some interpretations of quantum mechanics and theories of higher dimensions. In modern physics, the familiar three-dimensional space and one-dimensional time of ordinary experience might be merely the visible surface of a reality that extends through additional dimensions that we cannot directly perceive. String theory, for example, posits that the fundamental constituents of reality are not particles, but tiny vibrating strings existing in a 10 or 11-dimensional space, most of whose dimensions are curled up too small to detect. The many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, proposed by Hugh Everett in 1957, suggests that every quantum event causes the universe to split into multiple parallel universes, each representing a different possible outcome. The result is an infinite proliferation of universes, a cosmic multiverse of which our observable universe is just one tiny branch. While this is very different from the Gnostic picture of emanations from the pleroma, both frameworks envision a reality far vaster and stranger than the visible world of ordinary experience. More provocatively, the simulation hypothesis, popularized by philosopher Nick Bostrom in a 2003 paper, argues that if it is possible to create highly realistic computer simulations of conscious beings, and if technologically advanced civilizations have the motivation to create such simulations, then it is statistically likely that we are living in a simulation rather than in base reality. Some of our descendants, or some advanced alien civilization, might have created our universe as a simulation running on their computers, and we, as inhabitants of that simulation, would have no way to detect the difference from real reality. The parallel to Gnostic ideas is striking. Just as the Gnostics believed that the material world was a false or secondary creation by a lesser deity, ignorant of the true reality beyond, the simulation hypothesis suggests that our world might be an artificial construct created by beings outside the simulation who exist in a higher level of reality. The Gnostic archons, who rule over the material world and seek to keep souls trapped in ignorance, find a kind of analogue in the hypothetical programmers who have created the simulation and set its parameters. Nick Bostrom himself has not claimed any connection to Gnosticism, and the simulation hypothesis is offered as a serious philosophical argument based on probability theory, not as a revival of ancient mysticism. But the cultural resonance between the two is undeniable. Both suggest that the world we perceive might be a kind of illusion, a constructed reality that obscures a deeper truth. Both raise the question of whether we are being controlled or monitored by higher powers, and both suggest that the path to liberation involves recognizing the constructed nature of our reality. The philosopher David Chalmers, famous for his work on consciousness and his formulation of the hard problem of consciousness, has written about the epistemological implications of the simulation hypothesis. Chalmers argues that even if we are in a simulation, the objects around us would still be real in a meaningful sense. The simulated computer on which I type would be a real computer, made of simulated physics rather than base-level physics, but no less real for that. However, Chalmers acknowledges that living in a simulation would have profound implications for questions about the fundamental nature of reality, free will, and the existence and nature of God or gods. Another area where contemporary thought has converged with Gnostic themes is in the philosophy of antinatalism and pessimism. Antinatalists argue that coming into existence is always a harm, and that therefore procreation is morally wrong. The most prominent contemporary antinatalist philosopher, David Benatar, argues in his book Better Never to Have Been that life contains more suffering than pleasure, that non-existence harms no one, and that therefore it would be better if no one were born. While Benatar's arguments are purely secular and philosophical, they echo the Gnostic view that birth into the material world is a trap, a fall from a better state. The Gnostics believed that procreation was one of the mechanisms by which the archons perpetuated the imprisonment of divine light in matter. By refraining from procreation, Gnostic ascetics sought to deprive the archons of new bodies in which to trap souls. Contemporary antinatalists, while not believing in archons or trapped souls, similarly view procreation as the perpetuation of a harm that would be better avoided. The philosophical pessimist tradition, from Schopenhauer in the 19th century to contemporary thinkers like Thomas Ligotti, shares with Gnosticism a deeply negative evaluation of existence. Schopenhauer, influenced by Indian philosophy, taught that the world was the product of a blind, irrational will that drives all beings to suffer in their endless striving. Life is suffering, and the only escape is through the denial of the will to live. This is not identical to the Gnostic view, which sees the problem as ontological rather than existential, but both traditions agree that existence as we experience it is fundamentally unsatisfactory. Thomas Ligotti, in his book The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, draws explicit parallels between Gnostic themes and contemporary horror fiction and philosophy. Ligotti argues that horror as a genre is fundamentally about the recognition that consciousness is a mistake, that self-awareness is a curse that traps us in knowledge of our own mortality and the indifference of the universe. The Gnostic vision of the Creator as a malevolent or incompetent deity finds its echo in the cosmic horror of H.P. Lovecraft, where the universe is ruled by alien gods who are indifferent or hostile to human existence. Not all contemporary engagements with Gnostic themes are so dark. Some theorists in the digital humanities and the media studies have noted that the Gnostic myth provides a useful framework for thinking about information technology and virtual reality. The material world in Gnostic thought is a kind of illusion, a veil that obscures true reality. Virtual reality creates literal, artificial worlds, simulations that can feel real while we are immersed in them but that we know are constructions. The philosopher Byung-Chul Han, in his book Psychopolitics, argues that contemporary digital capitalism functions through a kind of psychic control that he compares to Gnostic archonic power. Instead of direct physical coercion, power in the digital age works through seduction, through making us want to submit, through convincing us that surveillance and data extraction are in our own interest. The algorithms that shape what we see online, the recommendation systems that guide our choices, the metrics that measure and gamify our behavior, all these function as a kind of digital archon, shaping our reality in ways we barely perceive. This line of thinking has given rise to a kind of digital Gnosticism among some tech-critical theorists and practitioners. If the algorithms and platforms of big tech function as archons, controlling and distorting our perception of reality, then the path to liberation involves developing the gnosis to see through these systems, to understand how they work and how they shape us. Just as the ancient Gnostics sought secret knowledge that would allow them to escape the control of the cosmic archons, contemporary digital Gnostics seek to understand and resist the control of corporate algorithms. The open source software movement, with its emphasis on transparency and user control, can be seen as embodying a kind of Gnostic ethos. Proprietary software, like the Gnostic material world, is opaque and controlled by external powers. Open source software, by making its code available for anyone to read and modify, offers a kind of gnosis, a knowledge that empowers users rather than keeping them in ignorance and dependence. Cryptography and privacy technologies like encryption and Tor have been described by some of their advocates in quasi-Gnostic terms as tools for achieving liberation from surveillance and control by state and corporate archons. The cypherpunk movement of the 1990s, which promoted the use of cryptography to protect individual freedom, was explicitly anti-authoritarian and emphasized the power of secret knowledge, though it did not explicitly invoke Gnostic language. The cryptocurrency movement, particularly in its more radical forms, sometimes adopts Gnostic rhetoric about escaping from the control of financial and governmental institutions. Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies are portrayed as a way to achieve financial sovereignty, to operate outside the system controlled by central banks and governments. The language of decentralization and trustlessness in cryptocurrency discourse echoes the Gnostic desire to escape hierarchical systems of control. It's worth noting that these contemporary appropriations of Gnostic themes are usually metaphorical rather than literal. Very few people today actually believe in the pleroma or the demiurge as objective metaphysical realities. But the Gnostic myth provides a powerful symbolic language for articulating feelings of alienation, entrapment, and powerlessness in the face of large impersonal systems, whether those systems are cosmic, psychological, political, or technological. One of the most significant developments in modern Gnostic scholarship has been the recognition of the prominent role that women played in Gnostic communities and the presence of feminine divine figures in Gnostic mythology. This has led to a recovery and revaluation of Gnostic texts by feminist theologians and scholars who see in them an alternative to the patriarchal structures of mainstream Christianity. The figure of Sophia, divine wisdom, is central to this feminist recovery. Unlike the male-dominated trinity of Orthodox Christianity, where the Holy Spirit's gender is ambiguous at best, Sophia is explicitly and undeniably feminine. She is not a goddess separate from the true God, but an aspect or emanation of the divine, sharing in the divine nature. Her story in Gnostic mythology involves autonomy, creativity, error, suffering, and ultimate redemption. Feminist scholars have pointed out that Sophia's fall is triggered by her desire to create independently, without her male consort. While the Gnostic texts themselves present this as a transgression, a violation of the proper order, a feminist reading can see it differently. Sophia's desire for independence and creativity is not a sin, but a legitimate expression of divine feminine power. Her error lies not in acting independently, but in the limitations of her power when separated from the masculine principle. The lesson then is not that women should be subordinate, but that both masculine and feminine principles are necessary for complete creation. Moreover, Sophia's suffering and her eventual redemption can be read as a mythological expression of women's experience in patriarchal societies. Sophia is assaulted and degraded by the archons, the male rulers of the lower world, just as women have been oppressed and violated by patriarchal power structures. But she is not destroyed. She retains her divine spark and eventually finds her way back to the pleroma, transformed and redeemed. This can be read as a mythic affirmation of women's resilience and ultimate spiritual equality. The most influential figure in the feminist recovery of Gnosticism has been Elaine Pagels, whose book The Gnostic Gospels, published in 1979, brought the Nag Hammadi text to the attention of a wide popular audience. Pagels argued that the suppression of Gnosticism by the Orthodox Church was not merely a theological dispute but a political struggle over power and social organisation. Pagels pointed out that Gnostic communities tended to be more egalitarian than Orthodox churches. While the mainstream church was developing a hierarchical structure of bishops, priests and deacons, all of whom were male, some Gnostic groups allowed women to serve as teachers, prophets and even priests. The Gospel of Mary portrays Mary Magdalene as the disciple who understands Jesus' teaching most deeply, and she is challenged by Peter, who resents her spiritual authority. The text portrays this as Peter's problem, not Mary's. The Gospel of Philip, another Nag Hammadi text, describes Mary Magdalene as Jesus' companion, whom he loved more than all the other disciples, even kissing her often. While the text is fragmentary and the exact nature of their relationship is unclear, it is evident that this Gospel grants Mary a position of special intimacy and spiritual understanding. Pagels argued that the Church's suppression of Gnosticism was in part motivated by a desire to establish a male-dominated hierarchy and to exclude women from positions of spiritual authority. By insisting on apostolic succession through an all-male line of bishops, by emphasizing the importance of the institutional sacraments over individual spiritual experience, the Church was consolidating power in the hands of men and marginalizing alternative forms of spiritual authority that were more open to women. This argument has been controversial. Some scholars have pointed out that not all Gnostic texts are favorable to women, and some contain misogynistic statements. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, ends with Peter saying that Mary should leave the disciples because women are not worthy of life, and Jesus responds by saying that he will make Mary male so that she can enter the kingdom of heaven. This is hardly a feminist sentiment, though it can be interpreted as a statement about the necessity of transcending gender categories rather than a literal devaluation of women. Other scholars have argued that Pagels overstates the egalitarianism of Gnostic communities and underestimates the diversity of practices in early Christianity. There is evidence that some Orthodox Christian communities also allowed women to play significant roles, at least in the earliest period, and that the exclusion of women from leadership was a gradual process that took several centuries to complete. Nevertheless, Pagels' work opened up a productive line of inquiry and made Gnostic texts relevant to contemporary debates about gender and religious authority. Whether or not the historical Gnostics were proto-feminists, their texts could be read in ways that challenged patriarchal religious structures and offered resources for feminist theology. Feminist theologians have also been interested in the Gnostic critique of procreation and the body. While much of this critique reflects a body-negative asceticism that many feminists would reject, some have found value in the Gnostic questioning of the naturalness of women's reproductive role. If procreation is the mechanism by which souls are trapped in matter, then the traditional assignment of women to the role of childbearers and child-rearers is part of the archonic system of control. This can be read as a mythological recognition of the way patriarchal societies have defined women primarily by their reproductive capacity. Contemporary goddess spirituality and neo-pagan movements have sometimes drawn on Gnostic imagery of Sophia as a divine feminine figure, though they typically strip away the Gnostic dualism and pessimism about the material world. In these appropriations, Sophia becomes a goddess of wisdom and creation, not fallen but eternally present, immanent in nature rather than transcendent and alienated from it. This is a significant departure from the original Gnostic vision, but it shows the adaptability of these ancient symbols to contemporary spiritual needs. The figure of Mary Magdalene has been particularly important in feminist Christian theology. The Orthodox tradition had downgraded Mary Magdalene from an apostle to a repentant prostitute, a demotion that some scholars see as an attempt to discredit her memory in response to the prominent role she played in Gnostic texts. The recent rehabilitation of Mary Magdalene, particularly after Pope Francis officially recognized her as the Apostle to the Apostles in 2016, owes something to the recovery of Gnostic texts that portrayed her as a leading disciple. Karen King, a scholar of early Christianity at Harvard Divinity School, has written extensively about Mary Magdalene and the Gospel of Mary. King argues that the conflict between Mary and Peter in the Gospel reflects real historical tensions in the early church between those who believed in the spiritual authority of visionary experience and those who insisted on the institutional authority of apostolic succession. The fact that Mary lost this argument and was marginalised in the Orthodox tradition reflects, in King's view, the victory of hierarchy and institution over charisma and individual spiritual experience. The discovery in 2012 of a small papyrus fragment that appeared to contain the phrase "Jesus said to them, 'My wife," caused a sensation, with some speculating that this was evidence of Jesus having been married, possibly to Mary Magdalene. The fragment, which Karen King dubbed the Gospel of Jesus' Wife, turned out to be a modern forgery, but the intense interest it generated showed the continued fascination with alternative narratives about Jesus and Mary Magdalene. While the question of whether Jesus was literally married is primarily of historical interest, the theological implications are significant. If Jesus was married, then marriage and sexuality could not be seen as inferior to celibacy, and the feminine would have a more central place in Christian theology. The Gnostic texts that emphasize Mary Magdalene's role, whether or not they imply a romantic or marital relationship, do grant the feminine a spiritual authority that Orthodox Christianity has largely denied. Perhaps the most challenging aspect of Gnostic thought, both in its ancient form and in its modern revivals, is its ethical implications. If the material world is evil or illusory, if it is the creation of a false god, then what is our moral relationship to it? Are we obligated to care for it and for the other beings trapped within it, or should we seek only our own escape? Does the Gnostic vision lead to compassion or to nihilism? The ancient Gnostics themselves were divided on this question. Some, as we have seen, adopted a severe asceticism, denying the body and the material world in order to free the spirit. Others, like Hippocrates and his followers, adopted a libertine approach, arguing that since material laws were imposed by the archons, those who possessed gnosis were free to transgress them. Most mainstream Gnostic teachers, like Valentinus, rejected both extremes, advocating a life of spiritual discipline that neither glorified nor utterly rejected the body. In the modern period, the ethical implications of Gnostic-like philosophies have been hotly debated. If the world is fundamentally flawed or illusory, does this provide an excuse for not caring about suffering or injustice? If the ultimate goal is to escape from the material world, does this lead to a withdrawal from social and political engagement? Some critics have argued that Gnostic thinking is fundamentally world-denying and can lead to passivity or even cruelty. If this world is not real or is the creation of an evil god, then why bother trying to improve it? Why work for justice, for the relief of suffering, for the protection of the environment? Better to focus on one's own spiritual escape and leave the world to its fate. Hans Jonas, a German-born philosopher who wrote extensively about Gnosticism in the mid-20th century, was concerned about these ethical implications. Jonas had been a student of Martin Heidegger and was influenced by existentialist philosophy. He saw in Gnosticism a profound expression of existential alienation, the feeling of being thrown into a world that is indifferent or hostile to human values and meaning. But Jonas worried that this alienation, if not balanced by a sense of responsibility to the world and to others, could lead to nihilism. In his book The Gnostic Religion, Jonas argued that the ancient Gnostics, despite their negative evaluation of the material world, were not nihilists. They believed in an ultimate good, the transcendent God of the pleroma, and they saw the material world not as meaningless, but as a realm of suffering that called for compassion. The divine spark within each person was something to be respected and nurtured, even if the body that housed it was seen as a prison. Thus, Jonas argued, Gnostic ethics could support a form of humanitarian concern, focused on liberating souls from ignorance rather than on reforming material conditions, but concerned nonetheless with the welfare of others. Other scholars have emphasized the egalitarian and anti-authoritarian implications of Gnostic thought. If salvation comes through direct personal knowledge rather than through institutional mediation, then all persons are potentially equal in spiritual dignity. The Gnostic rejection of the Creator God and his laws can be read as a radical critique of all forms of hierarchical authority, religious and political. In this reading, Gnosticism is not a withdrawal from the world, but a rebellion against its unjust structures. The political theorist Eric Voegelin, writing in the mid-20th century, took a more critical view. Voegelin argued that Gnosticism represented a dangerous tendency in Western thought, a tendency to view the existing order as radically evil and to seek salvation through revolutionary transformation. Voegelin used the term Gnosticism very broadly, applying it not just to ancient sects but to modern ideologies like Marxism and Nazism, which he saw as secularized forms of Gnostic thinking. According to Voegelin, the Gnostic belief that the world is fundamentally flawed leads to utopian thinking, to the idea that the world can and must be radically remade, and this in turn leads to totalitarianism and mass violence. Voegelin's argument has been influential but also widely criticized. Many scholars reject his broad use of the term Gnosticism to encompass all revolutionary ideologies, arguing that this obscures more than it illuminates. There are important differences between ancient Gnostic religion, which generally advocated spiritual withdrawal rather than political revolution, and modern political ideologies that seek to transform social and economic structures. Lumping them together under the label Gnostic may prevent us from understanding either one clearly. A more nuanced approach recognizes that the ethical implications of Gnostic thought depend on how it is interpreted and applied. A Gnostic worldview that emphasizes the unreality or evil of the material world could lead to indifference or cruelty, but it need not do so. It could also lead to compassion, rooted in the recognition that all beings share the same condition of imprisonment and suffering, all possess the same divine spark that calls for respect and care. The Buddhist concept of compassion provides a useful parallel. Buddhism teaches that the world of ordinary experience is characterized by suffering, and that liberation comes through recognizing the illusory nature of the self and the world. Yet Buddhism also emphasizes compassion for all sentient beings and active engagement in relieving suffering. The recognition that the world is in some sense illusory does not lead to indifference but to a deeper compassion, freed from attachment and ego but no less concerned with the welfare of others. Similarly, agnostic ethics could be based on the recognition that all beings are trapped in the same false creation, all suffer under the same archonic powers, all possess the same divine spark. This shared condition could be the basis for solidarity and mutual care. The goal would not be to improve the material world as such, which remains flawed by its nature, but to awaken souls to their true nature and to support each other in the journey toward liberation. Some contemporary Gnostic-inspired thinkers have emphasized this compassionate reading. Philip K. Dick, the science fiction writer whose novels explore themes of reality, illusion, and divine revelation, described his own Gnostic-influenced worldview in his posthumously published Exegesis. Dick believed that the world we perceive as a kind of prison or illusion, but he also believed in what he called the empire, a totalitarian system of control, and in the necessity of resistance against it. For Dick, recognizing the illusory nature of reality did not lead to passivity, but to active resistance against injustice and a search for truth. The question remains open. If the world is a lie, as the Gnostics claimed, what is our ethical relationship to it? Different people, drawing on Gnostic themes, have answered this question differently. Some emphasize withdrawal and individual spiritual quest. Others emphasize rebellion against unjust structures. Still others emphasize compassion for all beings trapped in the same condition. Perhaps the most we can say is that the Gnostic insight into the flawed nature of reality does not in itself determine our ethical response, but it does challenge us to think deeply about the grounds of ethics and the nature of our obligation to the world and to each other. Gnosticism, as an organized religious movement, was largely suppressed by the 5th century. But as we have seen, this Gnostic vision, the sense that the world is not what it seems, and that liberation comes through hidden knowledge, has persisted in various forms throughout Western history. In this section, we will trace some of the hidden streams through which Gnostic ideas flowed, even when the name Gnostic was forgotten or forbidden. One of the most important of these streams was Hermeticism, a tradition of mystical and philosophical texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, a legendary sage who was supposed to be a synthesis of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. The Hermetic texts were actually composed in the first few centuries of the Common Era, roughly contemporary with the Gnostic texts, and they share many themes with Gnosticism. The divine nature of the human soul, the fallen condition of humanity, the need for gnosis to achieve liberation, and a dualistic cosmology that distinguishes the spiritual realm from the material world. The most important Hermetic text is the Poimandres, which describes a visionary experience in which the narrator receives revelation from a divine being called Poimandres, who shows him the creation of the universe and the fall of the Anthropos, the primordial human. Like the Gnostic myths, the Hermetic account describes the soul's entrapment in matter and the need for knowledge to escape. However, Hermeticism is generally less pessimistic than Gnosticism about the material world and more optimistic about the possibility of transformation and spiritual ascent while still embodied. The Hermetic texts were largely lost to the West during the Middle Ages, but were rediscovered in the 15th century when a manuscript containing the Corpus Hermeticum was brought from Byzantium to Florence. Marsilio Ficino, the great Renaissance philosopher, was commissioned by Cosimo de' Medici to translate the Hermetic texts into Latin, and Ficino set aside his work on Plato to do so, believing that the Hermetic texts were of immense antiquity and importance. The publication of Ficino's translation in 1463 had a profound impact on Renaissance thought. Intellectuals and artists began to see in the Hermetic texts ancient wisdom that predated Christianity, and that might offer a path to reconciling Christian faith with classical philosophy and magic. The Hermetic vision of humanity as potentially divine, of the human mind as capable of ascending to knowledge of the cosmos and even of acting as co-creator with God, fit well with the humanistic spirit of the Renaissance. Hermeticism influenced Renaissance magic, alchemy and astrology, all of which were serious intellectual pursuits in this period, not the superstitions they would later be dismissed as. The goal of Hermetic practice was not to manipulate external forces for personal gain, but to achieve spiritual transformation, to ascend through knowledge to union with the divine. In this, it preserved the Gnostic emphasis on gnosis as the path to salvation. In the 17th century, the scholar Isaac Casaubon demonstrated that the Hermetic texts were not of ancient Egyptian origin, but were composed in the early centuries of the Common Era. This revelation damaged the prestige of Hermeticism among intellectuals who had valued it precisely because of its supposed great antiquity. But Hermetic ideas continued to influence esoteric and mystical traditions, particularly in the Rosicrucian and Masonic movements that emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries. The Rosicrucians, a mysterious group whose existence was announced in manifestos published in Germany in the early 17th century, combined Hermetic philosophy with Christian mysticism, alchemy, and visions of social reform. Whether the Rosicrucians actually existed as an organised group or were a literary hoax is still debated, but the Rosicrucian manifestos inspired the formation of numerous esoteric societies that claimed Rosicrucian lineage. Freemasonry, which emerged in the 17th century and became a major social force in the 18th, drew on Hermetic symbolism and ideas, though its exact origins and early teachings are obscure. Masonic ritual emphasizes the quest for light, the ascent from darkness and ignorance to illumination and knowledge, and employs symbols drawn from ancient architecture, alchemy, and mystical Christianity. While Freemasonry is not explicitly Gnostic, its emphasis on esoteric knowledge and spiritual transformation echoes Gnostic themes. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, with its emphasis on imagination, intuition, and the spiritual dimension of nature, also drew on currents of thought that had been shaped by Hermeticism and Gnostic ideas. William Blake, as we mentioned earlier, created his own elaborate mythology that included figures clearly derived from Gnostic cosmology. Blake saw the material world as fallen and constrained, and he celebrated the imagination as the divine faculty that could see through the illusion of matter to the eternal forms beyond. In Germany, the Romantic philosophers, particularly Schelling and later Hegel, developed a philosophical system that incorporated elements derived from Gnostic and Hermetic thought, though transformed into the language of modern metaphysics. Schelling's philosophy of identity, which saw nature as the unconscious spirit and spirit as conscious nature, and Hegel's dialectical vision of spirit's self-realization through history, both echoed the Gnostic theme of divine alienation and return, though in a thoroughly philosophical and non-mythological register. The 19th century saw an explosion of interest in occultism, spiritualism, and esoteric religion. The Theosophical Society, founded in 1875 by Helena Blavatsky, claimed to draw on ancient wisdom from the East and from lost civilizations like Atlantis. Blavatsky's teachings combined elements from Hinduism and Buddhism with Western esoteric traditions, including Gnosticism and Hermeticism. While Theosophy was not strictly Gnostic, it shared the Gnostic belief in a hierarchy of spiritual beings, in the imprisonment of spirit in matter, and in the possibility of spiritual evolution toward higher realms. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, founded in England in 1888, was more explicitly Western and Hermetic in its orientation. The Golden Dawn synthesized Kabbalah, alchemy, astrology, and ritual magic into a comprehensive system of spiritual development. Many prominent writers and artists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries were members of the Golden Dawn, including D.B. Yeats, Aleister Crowley, and Arthur Machen. Through these figures, Gnostic and Hermetic themes entered modern literature and art. In the 20th century, the anthroposophist Rudolf Steiner, who had initially been a leader in the Theosophical Society before breaking away to found his own movement, developed a Christian esotericism that incorporated Gnostic themes. Steiner taught that Christ's incarnation was a cosmic event, the penetration of the highest divine being into the material world, and that human spiritual evolution involves overcoming the forces of materialism and illusion. While Steiner's system is complex and differs in many ways from ancient Gnosticism, it shares the Gnostic sense of the material world as fallen, and the human being as possessing a divine spark that must be awakened. The Gurdjieff work, based on the teachings of the Greek-Armenian mystic George Gurdjieff, emphasized the idea that most people live in a state of waking sleep, mechanically reacting to external stimuli without true consciousness. The goal of the work is to awaken, to remember oneself, to become conscious. This emphasis on waking up from a state of sleep or illusion echoes the Gnostic theme of awakening to one's true nature. Gurdjieff also taught a cosmology involving multiple levels of reality and consciousness, though his system was more practical and psychological than mythological. In the 1960s and 70s, the counterculture movement rediscovered Gnosticism and related esoteric traditions as alternatives to mainstream Christianity and materialism. The publication of the Nag Hammadi texts in English made Gnostic writings accessible to a popular audience for the first time. Books like Elaine Pagel's The Gnostic Gospels and Joseph Campbell's The Hero with 1,000 Faces, which drew on Gnostic themes in its analysis of mythology, became bestsellers. New Age spirituality, which emerged in this period, incorporated many themes from Gnosticism, Hermeticism, and Theosophy. The idea that we create our own reality through consciousness, that the material world is in some sense illusory, that we are divine beings who have forgotten our true nature, and that spiritual evolution involves awakening to higher dimensions of reality. While much New Age teaching is more optimistic and less dualistic than classical Gnosticism, the underlying structure of fall and redemption through knowledge is similar. Contemporary chaos magic and postmodern occultism have also drawn on Gnostic themes while adapting them to a relativistic and pragmatic framework. Chaos magicians argue that belief is a tool that can be adopted and discarded as needed, and that the reality we experience is shaped by the belief systems we hold. This radical constructivism echoes the Gnostic sense that the world is in some sense a creation of mind, though without the Gnostic commitment to a single true reality beyond the illusions. One of the most controversial aspects of Gnosticism, both in ancient times and in modern scholarship, is its understanding of Jesus Christ. For Orthodox Christianity, Jesus is the incarnate Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, who took on human flesh, lived, taught, died on the cross as a sacrifice for human sin, and rose from the dead. The historical reality of these events, particularly the crucifixion and resurrection, is central to Orthodox faith. For the Gnostics, however, Jesus was understood very differently. He was not primarily a saviour who atoned for sin through his death, but a revealer who brought saving knowledge through his teaching. His significance lay not in what he did, but in what he revealed, and the nature of his being was ambiguous. Some Gnostics believed he had a real body, while others taught that he only appeared to have a body, that his physical form was an illusion. This latter teaching is called Docetism, from the Greek word dokein, to seem. Docetic Christians believed that Jesus was a purely spiritual being who only seemed to suffer and die. His crucifixion was either an illusion that deceived the archons and the crowd, or it affected only his apparent body while his true spiritual self remained untouched. The point of Jesus' mission, in this view, was not to suffer but to reveal, and physical suffering was irrelevant to a being who was not truly material. The Gospel of Peter, a non-canonical gospel known from fragments and from quotations in the Church Fathers, contains a passage that seems to reflect Docetic beliefs. It describes Jesus on the cross as being kept silent, as if he felt no pain. Some Gnostic texts are more explicit. The second treatise of the Great Seth from the Nag Hammadi library has Jesus say, "I did not die in reality but in appearance. It was another, their father, who drank the gall and the vinegar. It was not I. They struck me with the reed. It was another Simon who bore the cross on his shoulder. I was rejoicing in the height over all, and I was laughing at their ignorance." This teaching was anathema to Orthodox Christians. If Jesus did not truly suffer and die, then his death could not atone for the sin. If he did not truly take on human flesh, then human flesh could not be redeemed. The incarnation, the literal enfleshing of God, was essential to the Orthodox understanding of salvation. As Irenaeus argued, he became what we are so that we might become what he is. This required that Jesus be truly human, that he experience human limitation, suffering, and death. But for the Gnostics, the problem with the material world ran deeper than sin. The issue was not that humans had disobeyed God's commands, but that they were trapped in a false creation, imprisoned in bodies, kept ignorant of their true nature by the archons. Salvation did not require a sacrifice to appease God's wrath, because the Creator God was not the true God. What was needed was revelation, a message from the higher realm that could awaken souls to the truth. In the Gnostic understanding, Jesus was an aeon from the pleroma, a divine being who descended into the lower world to bring this saving knowledge. Different Gnostic systems described this descent in different ways. Some taught that Jesus united with the human Jesus at his baptism and departed before the crucifixion. Others taught that Jesus was entirely a spiritual being who only appeared to be human. Still others taught that Jesus had a special body, made of spiritual substance rather than ordinary matter, which allowed him to appear human while remaining divine. The Gospel of Thomas, perhaps the most important of the Gnostic Gospels, presents Jesus as a teacher of cryptic sayings, many of which seem designed to shock the hearer into a new way of seeing. There is no narrative of his birth, ministry, miracles, death, or resurrection. The Gospel consists entirely of sayings, some of which parallel sayings in the canonical Gospels, others of which are unique. The emphasis is entirely on Jesus' teaching, not on his actions or his death. Some of the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas seem to point to the kind of gnosis that the Gnostics valued. If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. This suggests that salvation comes from discovering something within oneself, from bringing forth an inner truth or potential. Another saying has Jesus declare, "I am the light that is over all things. I am all. From me all came forth, and to me all attained. Split a piece of wood. I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there." This suggests a vision of Jesus, or the Christ, as a cosmic principle present in all things, not confined to a single historical individual. The Gospel of Philip, another Nag Hammadi text, contains teachings about the nature of Jesus that are even more explicitly Gnostic. It distinguishes between Jesus, the historical person, and Christ, the spiritual principle or aeon that united with Jesus. It also contains obscure teachings about spiritual marriage and the bridal chamber, a ritual that seems to symbolize the reunification of the divided divine nature. Orthodox Christians read these texts and saw only confusion and heresy. The Gnostic Jesus seemed to them a bloodless abstraction, a teacher of riddles who bore little resemblance to the suffering Saviour of the Gospels. The Gnostic emphasis on secret knowledge seemed elitist, dividing humanity into those who could understand and those who could not, rather than offering a gospel for all. But modern scholars have been more interested in what these diverse portraits of Jesus reveal about the earliest period of Christianity. If there were multiple different understandings of who Jesus was and what his significance was, then Orthodox Christianity's claim to represent the original pure teaching becomes questionable. Orthodoxy appears not as the preservation of original truth, but as one interpretation among many, the one that happened to win out due to historical and political circumstances. Some scholars have argued that the historical Jesus himself was closer to the Gnostic portrait than to the Orthodox one, that he was primarily a teacher of wisdom, a Jewish sage whose original message was about inner transformation rather than about his own death and resurrection. This wisdom Jesus would have been more like a philosopher than a saviour, more like a revealer than a sacrifice. The emphasis on Jesus' death and resurrection in this view was a later development, created by Paul and other early Christian leaders. This argument remains controversial. There is no scholarly consensus on what the historical Jesus actually taught, or how he understood his own mission. But the Gnostic texts at least provide evidence that in the 2nd century, when Christianity was still a diverse and fluid movement, some Christians understood Jesus primarily as a teacher of secret knowledge rather than as a crucified saviour. For contemporary Christians interested in recovering neglected aspects of their tradition, the Gnostic Jesus offers an alternative to the substitutionary atonement theory that has dominated Western Christianity. Instead of a God who requires blood sacrifice to forgive sin, the Gnostic vision offers a God who sends a revealer to awaken humanity from ignorance. Instead of salvation through correct belief and moral obedience, it offers salvation through direct mystical knowledge. This has appealed to many modern people who find traditional Christian doctrines unconvincing, but who still feel drawn to the figure of Jesus. For them, the Gnostic Jesus, the teacher of wisdom and revealer of hidden truth, seems more accessible and more relevant than the dogmatic Christ of the creeds. Whether this represents a recovery of an authentic early Christian tradition or a modern reinvention is a question that continues to be debated. We have journeyed far from that cliff near Nag Hammadi where Muhammad Ali al-Saman broke open a jar and released the words of the Gnostics back into the world. We have explored the intellectual ferment of ancient Alexandria, the elaborate cosmologies of Valentinus and Basilides, the persecution of heresy by the Orthodox Church, the long silence of the Middle Ages, the gradual rediscovery of Gnostic themes in modern philosophy and psychology, and the contemporary resonance of Gnostic ideas in science fiction, digital culture, and feminist theology. What can we conclude from this journey? Was the world a mistake? Are we divine sparks trapped in flesh, ruled by ignorant archons, suffering in a false creation? Or is the Gnostic vision itself a kind of illusion, a projection of human alienation onto the cosmos, a refusal to accept the goodness of creation and the reality of embodied existence? The answer perhaps depends on what we mean by these questions. If we're asking about literal metaphysical truth, whether there really is a pleroma and a demiurge, whether the stars are really ruled by archonic powers, then the answer is almost certainly no. The Gnostic cosmology is a myth, symbolic narrative that embodies certain intuitions and experiences, but should not be confused with scientific or historical fact. But if we are asking whether the Gnostic vision captures something true about human experience, whether it articulates real psychological and spiritual realities, then the answer is more complex. There is no doubt that many people across cultures and centuries have felt the sense of alienation that the Gnostics expressed so powerfully. The feeling of being a stranger in this world, of not belonging, of being imprisoned in a reality that feels fundamentally wrong or incomplete. There is no doubt that many people have experienced moments of illumination, sudden insights that seem to reveal a deeper truth hidden beneath the surface of ordinary experience. And there is no doubt that we do live under systems of control, social, political, psychological, that shape our perceptions and limit our freedom in ways we often fail to recognize. The Gnostic myth gives symbolic form to these experiences. The demiurge represents the false authorities that claim absolute power. The archons represent the systems of control that keep us ignorant and compliant. The divine spark represents our deepest, truest self, the part of us that knows we are more than what we appear to be. And Gnosis represents the awakening that liberates us from illusion. Understood symbolically rather than literally, the Gnostic vision remains powerful and relevant. We may not believe in cosmic archons, but we can recognize the archonic function of algorithms that shape what we see online, of corporations that manipulate our desires, of ideologies that claim to possess absolute truth. We may not believe in a literal demiurge, but we can recognize the demiurgic quality of systems and institutions that present themselves as ultimate authorities while remaining blind to higher values and truths. The Gnostic emphasis on direct personal knowledge as the path to liberation remains relevant in an age of information overload and manufactured consensus. In a world where we are constantly told what to think by media, by advertising, by political propaganda, the Gnostic insistence that truth must be discovered through direct personal insight rather than accepted on authority is more important than ever. The Gnostic warning that the world we perceive may be a constructed illusion designed to control us takes on new meaning in an age of virtual reality, social media echo chambers, and algorithmic manipulation. At the same time, we must be careful not to fall into the dangers that the Gnostic worldview can encourage. The belief that the material world is evil or illusory can lead to a devaluation of the body, of nature, of the physical existence of other people. It can encourage a spiritual elitism that divides humanity into those who possess gnosis and those who remain trapped in ignorance. It can foster a contempt for the created world that absolves us of responsibility for its care and for the welfare of other beings. The challenge, perhaps, is to hold both truths simultaneously, to recognize that the world is in many ways a prison, a system of control and illusion, while also recognizing that it is our home, the place where we actually live, and that the other beings trapped here with us deserve our compassion and care, to seek liberation while remaining engaged, to see through illusion while acting with love, to recognize the divine spark in ourselves while honoring it in others. This is the difficult balance. The Gnostics themselves struggled with their balance and did not always succeed. Some fell into extreme asceticism that punished the body. Others fell into libertinism that ignored moral constraints. Most, probably, lived somewhere between these extremes, trying to navigate a world they believed was fundamentally flawed while still maintaining human relationships and ethical commitments. We too must navigate this tension. We live in a time when many of the systems that structure our reality, economic, political, technological, seem increasingly dysfunctional and divorced from human values. We live in a time when the constructed nature of our reality is more evident than ever, when we can see how our perceptions are shaped by forces that do not have our best interests at heart. The Gnostic insight that the world is, in some deep sense, a lie, resonates with contemporary experience in ways that it might not have for previous generations. But we also live in a time of ecological crisis, when the devaluation of the material world and the natural environment threatens the survival of countless species, including our own. We cannot afford a spirituality that encourages flight from the world rather than engagement with it. We need a spirituality that recognizes the world's brokenness while still affirming the value of life, that seeks transformation while practicing care, that pursues liberation while honoring interconnection. Perhaps then the legacy of Gnosticism is not a set of doctrines to be believed, but a set of questions to be lived with. What is real and what is illusion? Who are we really beneath the roles and identities that society assigns us? What systems of power and control shape our perceptions and limit our freedom? How can we awaken to a deeper truth? And once awakened, what is our responsibility to those who remain in darkness? These are not questions that can be answered once and for all. They are questions that each person, each generation must grapple with anew. The Gnostics of ancient Alexandria grappled with them in their context, creating elaborate mythologies and practicing various spiritual disciplines. The medieval heretics grappled with them in their context, often at the cost of their lives. Modern thinkers from Jung to Pagels to contemporary digital theorists have grappled with them in their own ways. And now we, in the early 21st century, must grapple with them in ours. We have access to the Gnostic texts themselves, no longer filtered through hostile accounts but speaking in their own voices. We have the tools of historical scholarship, psychology, and philosophy to interpret them. We have the lens of contemporary experience, of virtual reality, of algorithmic control, of ecological crisis, of social fragmentation, through which to read them. What we do with this legacy is up to us. We can dismiss the Gnostics as ancient heretics whose bizarre cosmologies have no relevance to modern life. We can romanticize them as possessors of secret wisdom that the Church suppressed. Or we can take them seriously as thoughtful people who grappled with fundamental questions about the nature of reality, consciousness, and liberation, and who developed one set of answers, strange and unsettling answers perhaps, but answers that still have the power to challenge and illuminate. The light is still imprisoned, the Gnostics would say. The divine spark within us is still trapped in matter, still subject to the control of powers that seek to keep us ignorant. But the knowledge that liberates has been preserved. It was buried in the Egyptian desert for 1500 years, but it has been recovered. It speaks to us across the centuries, offering not certainty but questioning, not comfort but challenge. In the end, perhaps the most important Gnostic insight is this: that things are not as they seem, that the reality we take for granted may be a construction, and that liberation begins with the courage to question what we have been taught to accept. Whether we call this questioning gnosis or critical consciousness, whether we frame it in religious or secular terms, it remains essential to human freedom and dignity. The world may or may not be a lie, but we are certainly capable of lying to ourselves, of accepting illusions as truth, of mistaking our prison for our home. The Gnostic myth, with all its strangeness and complexity, reminds us to remain vigilant, to keep questioning, to seek truth even when it is uncomfortable, and to never mistake the authorities of this world, whether religious, political, or technological, for ultimate truth. And so we return to that cliff near Nag Hammadi, where the ancient texts lay hidden in their jar, waiting. Muhammad Ali al-Samman could not have known what he had found. He was looking for fertilizer and found instead words that would travel around the world, that would change how we understand early Christianity, that would offer resources for feminist theology and psychological insight, that would speak to the anxieties and questions of the digital age. The jar is broken now. The words have been released. They are available to anyone who wants to read them, to struggle with them, to be challenged by them. They will not give us easy answers. They will not solve our problems, but they will remind us that the questions we are asking about reality and illusion, about power and freedom, about consciousness and cosmos, are ancient questions, questions that human beings have been asking as long as we have been able to reflect on our own existence. The Gnostics believed they had the answers to these questions. They were wrong, or at least their specific answers have not stood the test of time, but they were right to ask the questions, and they develop ways of asking them that remain powerful and provocative. In their strange myths of fallen Sophia and ignorant demiurge, of archonic powers and imprisoned light, they created a symbolic language for articulating experiences and intuitions that resist more literal forms of expression. We no longer believe in the pleroma or the demiurge, in archons or aeons, but we still know what it means to feel trapped, to sense that there is something more, something beyond the visible world of ordinary experience. We still know what it means to wake up, to have a moment of clarity that reveals how much of our life we have been living in a kind of sleep. We still know what it means to long for home, even when we cannot quite say where home is. These experiences are real, even if the Gnostic explanation of them is mythological. And the Gnostic texts, with all their strangeness, offer us one way of honouring these experiences, of taking them seriously, of exploring what they might mean. They remind us that Christianity, in its earliest period, was far more diverse and exploratory than later orthodoxy would suggest. They remind us that the questions of religion and spirituality are not settled, that every generation must engage them anew. And they remind us that the search for truth requires courage, requires the willingness to question authorities and received wisdom, requires the capacity to sit with uncertainty and paradox. In the Gnostic vision, the world is a laie, but knowing that is the beginning of truth. The creator of this world is not the true God, but recognizing that opens us to what is higher. We are prisoners, but the knowledge of our imprisonment is the first step toward freedom. The light is trapped in darkness, but it retains the memory of its source and the hope of return. Whether we accept this vision or not, whether we find it illuminating or disturbing, liberating or dangerous, we cannot deny its power. For 2,000 years, in various forms and under various names, it has persisted in Western culture. It has been suppressed and has resurfaced. It has been condemned and has been celebrated. It has been forgotten and has been remembered. The Nag Hammadi discovery ensured that it will not be forgotten again. The Gnostic voice, silent for so long, now speaks clearly. It tells us stories of cosmic drama and human destiny. It challenges us to question what we think we know. It invites us to look beyond the surface of things, to seek the hidden truth, to awaken from our sleep. What we make of this invitation is up to us. We can accept it or refuse it. We can engage deeply with these strange old texts or set them aside as historical curiosities. But we cannot unhear what they have to say. The jar has been broken. The secret is out. And in every breath of doubt, in every moment of questioning, in every intuition that there is more to reality than meets the eye, Sophia rises. The light is still imprisoned, but it remembers its home, and in remembering, it begins to return. Epilogue. The question remains. Muhammad Ali al-Samman died in 1998, more than 50 years after he broke open that jar on the cliff near Nag Hammadi. By then, the texts he had discovered had been translated into dozens of languages and had changed our understanding of early Christianity. Scholars had written thousands of pages analysing them. They had sparked religious controversies and inspired artistic works. They had contributed to feminist theology and depth psychology. They had found their way into popular culture through novels and films that explored Gnostic themes. But al-Samman himself remained a simple farmer, largely untouched by the intellectual storm his discovery had created. In interviews late in his life, he spoke matter-of-factly about the day he found the jar, expressing regret that his mother had burned some of the pages, frustration at the small amount of money he had received for the codices, but no sense of the cosmic significance that scholars had found in the texts. This perhaps is fitting. The Gnostics taught that most people remain in ignorance, that gnosis comes only to those who are prepared to receive it. Al-Samman was the instrument by which the texts returned to the world, but he was not necessarily meant to understand them. He was, in the Gnostic worldview, like so many others, doing his work in the material world, unaware of the deeper spiritual realities that the texts described. Or perhaps the Gnostics were wrong about this. Perhaps the distinction between the spiritual elite who possess gnosis and the ignorant masses who do not is itself a kind of illusion, a projection of human hierarchies onto the cosmos. Perhaps the truth is more democratic, that everyone has access to the divine spark, that everyone is capable of awakening, that the differences between us are matters of circumstance and opportunity, rather than essential spiritual nature. This has been a recurring debate throughout the history of Gnosticism and its modern interpreters. Is Gnosis an elite possession, or a universal potential? Are most people doomed to remain in ignorance, or can all be awakened? Is the Gnostic path one of withdrawal from the world and the masses, or one of compassionate engagement with all beings? The texts themselves do not offer a single answer. Different Gnostic teachers took different positions. Some were elitist, dividing humanity into spiritual types with different destinies. Others were more universal, suggesting that the divine spark exists in all humans, and that all are called to awaken. This ambiguity, this refusal to settle into a single coherent system, is perhaps one of the most characteristic features of Gnostic literature. The texts contradict each other. They use the same names for different beings. They tell different versions of the same myth. They are fragmentary, elusive, enigmatic. They seem designed to provoke thought rather than to provide answers, to raise questions rather than to settle them. This has frustrated scholars who want to define clearly what Gnosticism was and what Gnostics believed. But it may be that this very unsettledness is the point. The Gnostics were explorers of consciousness and cosmos, not systematizers of doctrine. They were trying to articulate experiences that resist literal description, intuitions that cannot be captured in propositions. They were using myth and symbol not to obscure truth, but to gesture towards truths that cannot be directly stated. If we read the Gnostic texts in this spirit, not as doctrinal statements to be believed or rejected, but as provocations to thought and exploration, then they remain alive and relevant. They invite us to question our assumptions about reality. They challenge us to look beneath the surface of things. They suggest that what we take to be solid and real may be more fluid and constructed than we realize. They remind us that consciousness is a mystery, that existence is strange, that we are stranger than we know. In the 21st century, these invitations and challenges seem more timely than ever. We live in an age of virtual realities and constructed identities, of algorithmic control and information warfare, of ecological crisis and social fragmentation. The Gnostic intuition that something is fundamentally wrong with the world as it is, that we are living under powers that do not have our best interests at heart, that liberation requires seeing through illusions and recovering forgotten truths. All of this resonates with contemporary experience. But the Gnostic vision also warns us of dangers. The contempt for the material world and the body can lead to ecological destruction and the devaluation of physical existence. The emphasis on esoteric knowledge can lead to elitism and conspiracy thinking. The dualistic division of reality into light and darkness, spirit and matter, good and evil, can lead to simplistic moral thinking and the demonization of others. The longing for escape from the world can lead to passivity in the face of injustice. The task, then, is not simply to embrace Gnosticism or to reject it, but to learn from it, to appreciate its insights while remaining aware of its limitations, to honour its questions while developing our own answers, to let it challenge us without letting it define us. The world may be a lie, but it is the lie we inhabit, the only world we have. Our task is not to escape it, but to transform it, not to reject it, but to redeem it, not to flee from matter, but to honour the spirit that dwells within it. If there is a divine spark within us, then there is a divine spark within all beings, and our obligation is to nurture that spark wherever we find it. This, perhaps, is the synthesis we need. The Gnostic awareness that things are not as they should be, that we are capable of more than we realize, that liberation is possible, combined with an incarnational affirmation of the value of embodied existence of the earth and its creatures, of the material world that is our home. We stand at a threshold. Behind us lies 2,000 years of Western history, in which Gnostic insights and questions have repeatedly emerged, been suppressed and re-emerged in new forms. Before us lies an uncertain future in which new technologies and old problems challenge us to think deeply about the nature of reality, consciousness, and freedom. The Gnostic texts recovered from their long burial speak to us across the centuries. They do not offer us a comfortable faith or easy answers. They offer us instead something more valuable, the challenge to think for ourselves, to question authority, to seek truth even when it is difficult, and to never mistake the way things are for the way they must be. The jar is broken, the words are free, and the question remains, what will we do with them? In the end, perhaps the most important legacy of Gnosticism is not any particular doctrine or practice, but simply this: the reminder that reality is always more than it seems, that we are always more than we appear to be, and that the work of awakening, of coming to see truly, is never finished. Each generation must do this work anew, using the tools and languages available to it, responding to the specific illusions and controls of its own time. The Gnostics did this work in their time, using the language of myth and the framework of Hellenistic philosophy. They created strange and beautiful texts that still have the power to move us, to trouble us, to make us think. They asked fundamental questions about existence and consciousness, about cosmos and creator, about imprisonment and liberation. We must do this work in our time, using our own languages and frameworks, responding to our own challenges. We may not believe in archons, but we must grapple with the systems of control that shape our lives. We may not believe in the pleroma, but we must attend to the intuitions of transcendence that arise within consciousness. We may not believe in the demiurge, but we must question the authorities that claim absolute power over truth and reality. The light is still imprisoned if we understand light as consciousness, as freedom, as the capacity to see truly and act authentically. We are still trapped if we understand trapped as referring to the systems, psychological, social, technological, that shape our perceptions and limit our possibilities. And gnosis is still needed if we understand gnosis as the direct, transformative knowledge that liberates us from illusion and opens us to truth. The Gnostic story is not over. It continues in us, in our questions and our searching, in our doubts and our intuitions. The texts found at Nag Hammadi are not relics of a dead past, but living voices that continue to speak, to challenge, to provoke. What they are saying is this: wake up, question everything, see through the illusions, remember who you are. The world you see is not the only world. The self you think you are is not your true self. The authorities who claim to know the truth are often blind. The systems that promise security are often prisons. But within you is a spark of light, a capacity for truth, a power of consciousness that can see through deceptions and touch reality directly. This spark is your birthright and your destiny. Do not let it be extinguished by the noise of the world, by the demands of the system, by the voice that tells you that what you see is all there is. Look deeper, question more, awaken to the truth that has always been within you, waiting to be remembered. This is the whisper from the sand, the message from the jar, the secret that 1500 years could not silence. The Gnostics are dead, but their question lives. What if the world is a lie? And following close behind it another question, more urgent and more personal. What then will you do? The answer to that question, your answer, lived out in the specific circumstances of your own life, is what the Gnostics ultimately called gnosis. Not a doctrine to believe, not a system to master, but a truth to embody, a light to kindle, a life to awaken. The jar is broken, the silence is ended, the question is asked, and across the centuries, across the distance between ancient Alexandria and the modern world, across the divide between sand and screen, between parchment and pixel, the invitation remains: come and see, Wake and remember. The world is not what it seems, and neither are you. In every breath of doubt, Sophia rises. The light is still imprisoned, but it remembers its home, and in remembering it begins, even now, even here, even in you, to return.